So I wanted to make this short video about web scraping, and namely I want to share with you how I think about web scraping. When I first learned how to scrape pages off the internet, it was very confusing to me. Things didn't make sense. There seemed to be no order. However, as I have learned about the structure of HTML pages and I've worked with Python a little bit more, it sort of makes sense now, and anytime I have to scrape a web page, I use the same process and I think about it in the same way, and so I want to share that process with you. And so let's just start by saying that web pages, contains content, and the content's inserted between tags. It can be HTML or CSS tags. The second thing is that tags on the web page can be nested, i.e. one tag can contain more tags, which can then contain more data. The fact that tags on a web page can be nested is actually the key thing to understand when trying to find a starting point when you actually scrape a web page. And so knowing that they're nested is actually very important. Third, Beautiful Soup is a package that allows you to search for tags, HTML tags within code, the HTML code, and then return the values between the tags in a form of a list. And this is actually very powerful because it will allow you to get and search for in very specific places of a web page to get to get the information that you want. Next, when you scrape web page, you have to use a little bit of knowledge about HTML and how the Google Chrome inspector works, so that you can find the HTML code related to the piece of content that you want on the page. As I'll talk about when we get into the code, I think about it as going fishing, namely fishing with a net, and or you can think about just searching for something. But this is important because there are two commands that we're going to talk about shortly, and that is find and find all. And there is a difference between both of them. And when you use both of them, there is a difference between both of them and when you use each of them. And so sort of thinking about, let's maybe use the metaphor of going fishing, and it will kind of help you understand when you need to use what. Next, scripts are fragile. Since the structure of the web page is fragile, therefore scripts to scrape a web page need to be developed at the time that they are needed. And this is actually important because you can write a script today for a web page and get the information that you need. However, if the owner of the page decides to change the page, your script may not work because it depends on the placement and the structure of the HTML tags. So as a result, it's best to develop scripts to scrape a web page when you need them. And as a result, it's best to store the data. That's the last point, but they're fragile. Next, the scraping process is very analytical and requires a lot of trial and error to get what you need. This is actually, to me, it's a very analytical process because it requires you to look at a web page, look at the code, and then try to figure out or decide what tool do I have in my tool belt that will allow me to get the data that I need. And so it's very analytical, and it does require a lot of trial and error, which is great because when you use Jupyter Notebook, it allows you to sort of iterate through the process to eventually land up at a stage where you can get what you need. Lastly, you're going to need to test and debug on the fly. This is just a nature of it. It's a very raw process, and you're going to make mistakes the first time through. And then lastly, it's best to store the data that you get from scraping a page in a database or a CSV file, just so that you have a copy of the information somewhere. Because number one, you went through all that work to scrape the page in the first place, so you might as well store it somewhere. And then number two, your script may not work next week, so at least get a copy of what you scraped today. And so knowing all of this really helps me, and I hope it helps you understand sort of the high level of what you're trying to do when you scrape a web page. And if I want to add one more thing here, it's to know what you want before starting. And that goes without saying, because if you don't know what information that you are going to want from a web page before starting, you can end up chasing your tail, just because of the structure of HTML and how things get nested and all that. So know what you want before starting. So knowing all this, let's jump over to my browser here. So this is just the Beautiful Soup documentation. There's a lot of information online for Beautiful Soup, and I think the documentation is actually, I understand some of it. So I understand where I need to understand things. So I think it's pretty good. So let's pick a page to scrape. So we all like Taco Bell. And so I figured, well, let's just scrape the reviews off of the Taco Bell page, off of Yelp. Now, I'm only going to scrape the reviews off of the one page that we're looking at here. If we wanted to scrape the page off of if we want to scrape all the reviews, we're going to have to change the structure of the HTML in the script, or we can use something like Splinter or one of those tools to sort of iterate through the pages for us. But in this case, I'm only going to scrape the first page, and I'm going to scrape, the reviews off the first page. I'm going to scrape the review, and I'm going to scrape the number of stars for that review. So let's jump over to the inspector. So let's highlight this, go to the inspector, and see what we have. And so if you look at the inspector, and this is the first time you're looking at the inspector, it looks like a lot of stuff. But what's kind of neat is that when you highlight it on the page and you open the inspector, it actually shows you where in the HTML code that is. And so as we can see here, the code is between a p tag. That's important to remember. And what we can also see is that once we start to sort of just move up and down the code, you see things on the left-hand side start to highlight. And this is important because this is actually highlighting the tags that are containing the information that is, showing up in the highlighted part on the page. And so what we're going to need to know is okay, is there a tag that contains all of the information and potentially more information that we may want from this website? If one exists, great. If it does, and if it does exist, what is it? So you can just see here that, this is div class review sidebar, and I can see that it's showing up, it's highlighting Lady Loops L from Los Angeles. She wrote this, or this person wrote this review. And then if you go to div class review with sidebar, you can see you get that. But what's interesting here is that if I go to review wrapper, I get one. And if I go to review content, you can see that I get another one, and it contains the review plus the star rating. And so that's interesting because those are the two things that I want. And so I want to keep track of that review content. And generally, it's best to inspect another part of the page just to see that you understand the structure correctly. So here I'm going to jump to another review. There again, the p tag, the text is highlighted by this p tag here. And then if I just sort of scroll up and down, you see that review content is also being highlighted there, and it also has the text and the star rating. So at this point, I'm going to need to make an assumption. The assumption is going to be that this tag, div class review content, contains all of the information that I want for this scraping job. And I'm going to have to run with that assumption because you can spend all day analyzing this HTML and not do anything. And so it's best to just make an assumption and run with it. So the first assumption is that div class review content, I'm going to write this down, div class review content is sort of the tag that contains all the information that I want. And again, I'm going for the text of the review plus the number of stars. So I'm going to start with the review content tag. And again, I'm making an educated guess that this tag contains all and potentially more of the information that I may want. But that's good. So we're going to start there. So let's open up Jupyter Notebook. So I'm going to actually just copy this URL here. And so import requests as R, from BS4, import beautiful soup as soup. I typically just store the HTML or the URL in its own variable. And then what I do here is I say data equals r.get and then URL. This is the normal way to download data using request. And what's interesting is that if you run this, you can see here it's running. Now the number is back, it's done, nothing happens. The thing here that is important to know is that you want to know that you successfully downloaded the data or you were able to access the page and that was successful, and you don't really know up until this point. So the best way to do this is actually look at data and see what you get. So this says response 200. This means that the code or the script made a request to the server, the Yelp server, for the data on this one page, and then the server responded back with the data successfully, and I get a 200 tag. So this is a really good check because you don't want to start getting more into the script only to find out that you were unsuccessful at making the connection in the first place. So that's what happens. And so now what we want to do is we want to say page data equals soup. So we want to take this data and we want to read it into beautiful soup. And so we can say page data equals soup dot data dot text, and then we're going to have to select a parser. Generally, HTML parser works. Sometimes XML parser will work also. But what this line of code is doing here is it's taking the data that it got back from this GET request and storing that in this, storing it in this beautiful soup object. And so what you can do is it successfully stored it in there. Let's just look at it. Let's see what it looks like. It looks like a mess. So you can see here, this is it's like the matrix, but this is the soup. This is really hard to read. This is pretty ugly. So another thing you can do is you can say page data dot prettify, and what that should do is print that. This should make it a little bit more readable, but it still depends. It's still a mess. So it doesn't matter because we know what tag we're going after. We don't really have to look in this. It's better to look at the HTML of the site as opposed to looking at it in here. And so now that we have the data stored in page data, now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to find all the information within the tag that we selected. Remember, this is the tag that we're going after is div class review content. So the way that we do that is, now I'm going to bring in the fishing metaphor. We're going to go fishing and we're going to cast a net, and we're going to cast it far and wide to get all of the information on the web page that is held within the tag div class review content. We're going to get all the information, and that's important. So we'll say page data.find all. We could go div, and there's two ways that you can do this next one. I prefer to use a dictionary. It was div class review content, right? From here, div class review content. And so what you can say is you can say div class, pass as a dictionary, review content. And what this does is this goes out and returns all the information that is held that is a child of div class review content, and it stores each occurrence in a list. And that's important to know because we're going to have to iterate through this list later to get what we want. So this stores all the information for div class review content in a list. And you can tell because if we just look at the 0th one, this is all the information for the first element in the list. And so let's do a sanity check here. It says never fails. Every time I come here, no matter how busy they are, the employees at the location are always super nice. So let's see if that is the first one. It should be. Yes. Never fails every time I come here, and it had a 5-star review. That's the text. You can see here that the review is 5 stars. So what this verifies that our assumption is correct, that by searching for or finding all the instances of div class review content, we got the information that we wanted in addition to more stuff. You always want to approach the first step by casting your net far and wide and returning the information that you want and then some. It's better to have more and then pare back as opposed to have less because you won't be able to grab more. And so find all is a way to just cast your net far and wide. So what we can do at this point is this is the first element in this list, and now we can just play with it. So what we could do at this point is we could say, generally what I like to do here is I like to store this. So let's see here. Let's say, I don't know, soup data equals that. And I'll store all of it in there. And then what I'll say is soup data equals 0. And then now let's go after the review. Remember, the review, as we looked back at the actual HTML, the review was actually in a p tag that was a child within review content. So what we can say is we could say soup data 0 because we're only working on the first one, and this is the trial and error part. We're only working on the first one. We can say find p, and then we could say text. So this actually returns the review. Returns the review, and that's what we want. The difference here is that I've used find, not find all. And the way that I think about it is that find, I'm just looking in the net. And so I don't want to find everything because I'm looking in the net, I'm only looking at the 0th item in this net. And so I don't want to find all, I only want to find the occurrence of the p tag within this entry. And that's what I have here. And so if I go soup data 0 find p text, I get the text. And what we can do is we can test, and we can actually just traverse this manually. And you can say, okay, if we look at the second one, I get that. I love Taco Bell, I'm not afraid to say it. There's the review there. If I take the second one, or the third one, I'll say simple and sweet prose. You can say there it is. So that's the third one. So I think that what this shows is that this is a list, and you can iterate through this object called soup data. So I'm going to turn it back to the 0, 1 just to be organized. So now we have the review. Now what I want to do is I want to look for the star rating. Now remember, the star rating was actually in over here. Star rating was over here, and there's different ways to look at it. There's a alt attribute here. I may want to work with that one. So let me try to find that. So the alt attribute. So if I go back to my Jupyter notebook, I can see here that the alt attribute here says 5 stars. And so let's work with that one. So let's find the image. And then within that image, let's try to find the alt attribute. So we can say soup soup data 0, because we're working at the 0 element. We can say find. We can say image, because we want that tag. We want the image tag. And let's see what we get. We get this one piece here, which is that one piece there. So that's good. We're in the right area. And so now we just have to traverse this as if it was, a JSON. So what we could say is we could say alt. And we get 5-star rating. So lo and behold, we can get 5-star rating. We can pull out the 5-star rating from this soup here. So that's good. But what if we don't want all this other stuff and we just want the numerical value for the 5-star rating? Maybe we're going to do some machine learning, and so we don't want the text, we just want the number. So what we could do is we could split, split, we could split on the spaces, and what this will do is that this will take the 5.0 and store it. It will form a list of 3 items. The first item will be, or the 0th item will be 5.0. The second item will be the star, the word star, and the third item will be the word rating. And so if I do that, that's exactly what happens. And if I say 0, then I get 5. So I'm sort of thinking on the fly here because, I just want the 5, and so I kind of have to be crafty in the way that I write the code. But you can do it that way if you want to store it as the 5-star rating. You can do that. You can do whatever you want, just depending on what your needs are. And so what we've learned up until this point is that we've written short snippets of code to get information, to return the information that we want for each entry based on all of this mess here, this soup. And so now what we want is we've only returned the first entry. If we want to return all of them, we're going to have to iterate through each value of this soup data object. So what we're going to have to do at that point is that we're going to have to generate a list. We're going to have to generate a for loop to iterate through everything. So let's think about what we want to do here. We have a way to get the data. So now we need to think about how do we want to store the data. Do we want to store it in a list? How do we want to store it? Generally, the way that I work is I like to store things in CSVs because they're simple to use and pass around, and everybody can generally read a CSV into Pandas, into a data frame. So I generally like to store things in CSVs. So I'm going to actually recommend that we do that. So what I'll do is the approach here is I'm going to loop over soup data. I'm going to store the items that we found in our development, or in our I don't know, our survey, in a data frame. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send the data frame to a CSV so we can store it. I can't type store it. So that's the approach now. And in terms of the data, I'll take the text. The full star rating, since we have it, and then the numerical star rating, just so that we have everything. Maybe we want, I don't know. So this is our workflow. So what we're going to do here is we need to import pandas as PD. And what we need to do is create an empty data frame. So pd.data frame, empty data frame there. So now what we need to do is we need to iterate through this soup data object. So let's write our for loops. For each in soup data, what we want to do here is say that a review, so each review equals, I'm just going to copy this here, but I'm going to have to modify it to replace that with each. And then I'm going to say num stars equals this one. We'll have to modify it to work on the step at which the loop is on each. And then what I'm going to say is I'm going to say full rating, full stars equals that. Modify it each. So I have there. And so now for each step of this for loop, I'm going to be pulling out the entire text rating, the number of stars, just the numerical value of the stars, and then the full string with the star rating in it. So now what we want to do is store this in a list. So what we could say is we could say df equals df dot append dot pd dot data frame. And then what we want to do is send it a dictionary. And what we could say is we could say review. We'll call that column review, and we'll store each review in there. We'll say star number, which is going to be that one, and we'll say num stars. And then we'll say, I don't know, full rating, and then we'll just call that one full stars. So that's, I'm creating 3 columns in my data frame. The first one will be called review, and that will hold the text reviews. The second one will have be called star number, which would be just the numerical value of the star rating. The third one will be the full rating, which would be the text string of the full rating. So once we have that, we have to add a couple more things just so that this works. We have to say index equals 0. And then what we're going to have to say, ignore index equals true. And let's see, I think this will work. Invalid syntax, naturally. So there's a comma there. Okay, so we've iterated through and we've stored everything in this data frame called df. Let's take a look at it. There it is. And every Yelp page has 20 reviews. And that's what we have here. And it's exactly what we wanted. Star number, review, full rating. And so if we just, for grins, what we could do is we could say df.iloc, just look at the first one, or just, let's be interesting, let's look at the 10th one. We can say, okay, review, and that's the review right there of this, of what we got. And so that just sort of goes to show that we've got everything that we want. And finally, like I said, we've went through all this work. Let's do something with it. So it's best to just say to CSV. Let's just say reviews.csv index equals false. And that will send the data to a CSV file, which I need to find. Let's see, Taco Bell scrape. There it is. Reviews. Let's open it up. You can't see that. There it is. And there it's our reviews. And so at least now we have a copy of what we've done. And we can save it. And if we want to load it back into Pandas next week, we can do it. And so generally this is the way that I think about web scraping. And you can see it's a trial and error process. But the 3 points that I want to make is, I want to reiterate, is this. When you're looking through the HTML, you want to find the tag. You want to find the tag in the inspector that will give you, that you're going to have to make a decision on this, but you're going to want to find the tag that will give you the information that you want and then some. So that's the first thing. You're going to have to make a guess about what tag that is. And in this case, it was div class review content. And then once you know what that tag is, you go fishing for that tag using Beautiful Soup, using find all, and find all returns all the data, all the data that is in div class review content. And you only look, if you notice this, I've only used find all once, and that's because I've casted my net only one time. Every subsequent time that I've been traversing down, I've been using find, and that's because I am looking into the net that is soup data that originated from find all, and I'm looking for specific tags that I want. And so you can see here that everything is stored in soup data. I did find all. But when I went for the p tag and I went for the text, I did find. When I was looking for the star rating, I found image, but I used find again. And then even when I was looking for the string, I used find. And so that is, to me, was the most confusing thing about web scraping. And once I understood it from this net metaphor and the difference between find all and find, and finding a tag that will return the information that you want and then some, it started to make a lot of sense. And so, I just want to share this with you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss, but hopefully this sort of clears up a little bit of the mystery behind web scraping. Thanks.